Aloha and welcome to Talk Story with Keli'i Akina on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I'm your host, Keli'i Akina. My guest today is Professor Colin Moore, a political scientist at the University of Hawaii. Please join us for our conversation, which I know you'll find fascinating, about politics in Hawaii in 2026. Colin, welcome to the program.
Happy to be here.
So glad you're here and Happy New Year to you. It seems like we've been doing this program almost every year that we've come on the air, and I'm so glad that I have you to have your brain to pick.
It's always fun.
Well, just recycle the answers of the past, or maybe there's something new in politics. What would you say?
I think that there's certainly new developments. Hawaii politics, as a rule, tends to be relatively stable, but I think we've seen some movement in a variety of interesting angles. I'll start out with the broad picture, maybe for folks who are a little less familiar with the landscape. Hawaii, as everyone knows, is a very blue democratic state, one of the most in the nation. But I think the thing that is sometimes misunderstood is that although this is a very democratic state, I don't think it's as ideologically progressive as states like California or Washington or Oregon. It tends to be our Democratic Party, although very dominant, tends to be more of a centrist, old-fashioned. I often call it the last bastion of the New Deal. It's very pro-labor. But it tends to be a little more moderate on social issues, at least compared to the Democratic parties of some states on the mainland. Among other things, keeps us somewhat unique.
And that's an interesting characterization of our democratic state. Would you say that the party is monolithic in terms of ideology, or have you seen diversity?
Oh, there's definitely diversity, and that's one of the more interesting developments I think you've seen on the Democratic side. We'll talk about the Republicans, I think, in a few minutes. That there is a certainly more vocal progressive faction. You have, I think most famously, you saw the defeat of House Speaker Scott Saiki against progressive firebrand Kim Koko Iwamoto in Kaka'ako. I think that shocked a lot of longtime political observers. It's extremely rare in Hawaii for a senior Democrat to be defeated in a primary. So I think it shows that there is greater support and movement for progressives. There's been some other younger progressives elected in recent years, and that faction has become a little more vocal. At the same time, I don't want to overstate the point here. I mean, although more progressives have been more vocal, they're still, for the most part, dominated by the more moderate members of the centrist Democrats. If you look at the two leaders, House Speaker Nadine Nakamura, Senate President Ron Kochi, they're traditional moderate Democrats. I mean, they all have some progressive opinions, but for the most part, the leadership tends to be very centrist in the state house.
Now, wouldn't you say that whether it's within the Democratic Party or across the board politically, we've basically had a consensus style of politics in Hawaii, something deeply rooted in our multicultural background, our idea of ohana and aloha and so forth. As we enter 2026, we're starting to see, I think, a little more mainland style partisanship seeping into our local politics. What are your thoughts about this?
I think that's right. I mean, I think you're seeing Republicans have some notable success in many ways. The most successful election they've been having since the Linda Lingle eras, which really was the high point for Republicans in post-statehood Hawaii. You've seen the vote share that President Trump got in 2016. It was 30%. 2020 was 34%. 2024 it was 37%. The west side of Oahu has elected a lot of Republicans. They captured that state Senate seat. And so now Republicans have, certainly Democrats still have a supermajority, but I think Republicans have enough seats to be a factor in the legislature, whereas years before, they could be and largely were ignored. So I do think that you've seen an interesting resurgence. I don't know if it necessarily means we have a more partisan environment than we have in the past, but it certainly shows that there is an appetite for electing Republicans in a way that maybe there wasn't 10 years ago.
Well, that's an interesting observation, the resurgence of Republicans in the political scene here in Hawaii. What do you think is the cause of that? What's behind it, especially in light of the fact that we haven't necessarily seen popularity for the president of the United States at the in terms of the Hawaii perception of the federal.
That's right. I mean, although I would say that, as I said before, that Trump has increased his vote share every election, which is somewhat surprising. I think the Republicans to me are the most interesting group in the state because um, they have they often seem to be their own worst enemies. I mean, despite recent electoral success, the party itself is continually going through these periods of infighting where they are overthrowing their chairs. And that makes it very hard to recruit candidates and organize. Despite that, and I think because of the effort of a few particular Republicans, they've managed to recruit some high quality candidates recently and get some lucky breaks to the point where they have 3 Senate seats, 9 House seats. And what draws people to the Republican Party here, I think, is maybe the most interesting question. And I think that there's some groups. I think that there's maybe a third who I would call committed MAGA Trump Republicans. Maybe less than a third now who are traditional Republicans. I mean, the folks who used to be the backbone of the party, business owners, uh, uh, traditional Chamber of Commerce Republicans. And then there are a third, and this is where I try to explain, at least this is what I think is going on the resurgence on the leeward side of Oahu, basically populists who are voting for Republicans, not so much because they agree with all of the ideological positions, particularly all the positions on the mainland, but because they disagree and are very critical of the Hawaii Democratic Party, the state of Hawaii. I think this explains the appeal of many Native Hawaiians for supporting Republican candidates. And I think this in part explains their success on the West Side. And I think you see that even how the most successful Republicans have positioned themselves, and maybe we can talk about that in a second. I think they understand that, and they've been very strategic in speaking to those issues in that community.
I think you make a good point that it may not necessarily be the strength of the Republican Party in Hawaii that is resulting in the resurgence of Republicans, but something happening at a grassroots level, something happening amongst the people. And would you say that this is unique to those who express themselves as Republicans, but are they having something in common with Democrats and the general population at large?
Sure. I mean, the sense of visceral frustration, I think, helps explain both the rise of the progressives and the increase in Republicans in Hawaii. That there's a sense, particularly among younger people, that the Democratic establishment is failing on a number of issues, and we can recite these. We know them all very well: housing, cost of living, helping local families stay here in Hawaii and not move to the mainland. I think that there's a sense that they represent the status quo. And so that, in part, I think explains the appeal both on the left and the right, particularly among younger voters. And so that, Republicans in particular, though, I think have been very zeroed in on a kind of local brand of issues and have not done so much to connect what their campaign platforms are, what their policy priorities are to what's going on in the mainland Republican Party. I think that it's very rare, and although it does happen, there are some Republicans who identify closely with President Trump. But for the most part, when I see Republican candidates and Republican elected officials speak, they tend to be very focused on cost of living issues. To the extent that they connect with the mainland Republican Party, I mean, you already see this in State Senator Britton Awa's campaign. It is to articulate the idea that Hawaii needs Republicans because that will bring Hawaii's voice to the national table. There tends to be less of a robust defense of some of the positions of the Trump administration.
When it comes to cost of living issues, it definitely Republicans are touching at a chord and a nerve amongst the people of Hawaii because all of us who live here face that. And so that's very much something of interest to the majority of people in the state. But it seems as though some issues that had been relegated to Republicans are gaining a broader traction now, such as, for example, what's going on in terms of the call for voter rights and election integrity. We've seen the State Office of Elections recently recommend a return to in-person voting, and that reflects a Republican platform. You've looked at this type of thing in your career in public policy, um, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with you. Let me offer a separate example. One I know you know well because Grassroot Institute has been discussing this long before I think it became mainstream, which is um, more effort to lower taxes, of course, to make it easier to construct housing, to reduce bureaucratic burdens. Those are issues that were not mainstream for many years, as you know, maybe better than anybody, that have become embraced by the Democratic Party, by the governor, by the House leadership. I think everyone, for the most part, agrees that we need to work harder to make it less expensive to build housing if we want more housing. That Hawaii's tax burden was unsustainably high, particularly its income tax for working families. And you saw a massive tax cut go through from the Hawaii Democratic supermajority. And so I do think that those ideas that used to be Republican or libertarian ideas have gone very mainstream. Now, the election integrity one, I would not characterize as one that necessarily has gone mainstream. It's certainly not been embraced by Hawaii Democrats. I mean, I think that the counter argument to this is that mail-in voting is secure, that they have no plans to abandon mail-in voting. I support mail-in voting. But what I would say, I think is interesting on the election issue is that many residents don't feel that this is a secure technology. And I think one thing that I notice election after election, anyone who follows elections notices that there's a lot of residents who want to vote in person, who want to cast that ballot and put it in the box that day. And we've seen for the last few years huge lines that have delayed the election results because the election office hasn't been prepared for that. And I've long felt that, although, as I said, I think mail-in voting is secure and I do support it, that people should also have the ability to cast their ballot in person on the day of the election if that's what they choose to do, if they feel that's more secure or they like to do it. I think the elections office should accommodate it. It's not going to cost very much money. And so I've long been critical of this sense that the elections office seems to be fighting local voters who want to cast their ballot in person. We should accommodate that, but I certainly wouldn't be in favor of getting rid of mail-in voting and going back to only in-person ballots.
Well, let me give you another issue that simply seems not to be a partisan one, and in some ways connected with the history of Hawaii. We've been in the news recently for several celebrated cases of government corruption, ranging from chief of police Kealoha to state legislators taking bribes. In fact, the question of the day at the legislature is, did you take a brown bag with $35,000? Now, how does this affect voter confidence overall in our elected officials?
Oh, it's a sort of thing that breeds cynicism. And I think if you ask local people, do they think that there are lots of corrupt government officials? I think, unfortunately, they would probably say yes. I wish I had some polling data on that. And that in many ways is a tragedy because the vast majority of our elected officials are honest and work hard. And so that undermines faith in the democratic process. I think it reduces the reputation unfairly for a lot of our elected officials. But we do have a problem. And I think that, to be fair, I think that, former Speaker Scott Sykes' Blue Ribbon Commission, led by Judge Dan Foley, I think made a lot of good reforms. They suggested a lot, not all of which were implemented, but that was a terrific start. I think that both the Kealoha scandal and the later Ty Collins scandal really did shock a lot of elected officials. I mean, I think the situation was much worse than they even anticipated. So I do want to give credit, but I do think it's still a problem. And part of it's a problem really for I think two reasons. It's always been with us is that we do have essentially a one-party state, and one of the reasons you need a viable opposition is that they're the ones who kind of expose these cozy relationships. And I think that in many ways Hawaii has lacked that. It gets a little too comfortable, and anyone who's read the history of Hawaii, certainly post-statehood history, knows that there's long been this cozy relationship between economic interests and politicians, and that has sometimes resulted simply in economic opportunities being offered to elected officials, but also sometimes straight up bribes like we've seen recently. So I think we have to be particularly vigilant because we know that there's a history in this state of that sort of corruption, not one that's necessarily unique to Hawaii. You see this in other big states, although they tend to be states where one party has been dominant for a very long time. So I would like to see more reforms. I mean, I think that one of the there are a few key reforms that I support. One is to take a more careful look at whether or not major government contractors or people who work for those contractors should be offering campaign donations. I think that can be a big problem because even if they're not offered during session, it's not hard for elected officials to understand where those funds come from. And that does give them, I think, potentially special consideration when it comes time for state contracts. There's other proposals that are more radical. The legislature has debated for the last several years a potential publicly financed election system that exists in some states. I'm not sure that there's much political will to enact something like that, but that is another potential way that you could try to cut this tie between campaign donations and policy outcomes. But no matter what, it's a challenge. And of course, as I always tell people, most of these reforms would not get at what we saw in, for example, the Ty Collins scandal, which is just straight up corruption, or this $35,000 that we still can't trace. Those things have always been illegal. They continue to be illegal. And that really comes down to more, I think, of the culture of the legislature. I think that's less true today than it used to be, but I think for a long time, there was the legislature was probably not as good at policing its own. I think that there were elected officials who probably knew that there were or suspected that there was corrupt behavior going on and said nothing. And I think that also is a problem.
Well, we'll see whether or not there's much of an impact in the elections which are coming up this year. Now, many issues are factoring into the docket for the elections. One of them is most definitely the economy and the historic tax cuts that were promised by the state legislature and the government, the largest tax cut in Hawaii's history that was legislated just a couple sessions ago. But going into this term, there's talk of putting that on pause. And what is the reaction amongst the people? Is it vocal enough to cause the government to reconsider the pause, or is this just a typical political play?
Well, I think it depends on how the pause is structured, of course. I think if the tax cuts were entirely put on pause, I think you would likely see a public outcry. But from what I understand, it looks like they are considering putting tax cuts for the highest earners, people making over $200,000 on pause. Those voters may be frustrated, they may be angry, but I don't think it's likely to translate into the level of outcry that would really have major electoral consequences. I do expect Republican candidates to make use of this, for their campaigns. Certainly those who favored these relatively aggressive tax cuts. But if it's structured that way, if it's slowed or put on pause, mainly for the highest earners, I don't expect you to see that. In fact, what I do think, though, is you're likely to see the governor in particular, but other Democratic leaders do a lot of work explaining that for most people, they were going to get their tax cuts. I think that they're very worried that this message could get out of control, that people will begin to think that all of the tax cuts are put on pause. So I think I'm very curious to see how the governor handles this in his state of the state and how the Democratic leadership handles this, because I think they know that the last thing they want to do is put all of the tax cuts on hold, or for most voters to get the impression that those tax cuts are all being put on hold.
Now, Colin, I want to ask quickly what your take is on whether Native Hawaiian issues will factor significantly in the upcoming legislative session. As you know, there's a significant momentum growing for a constitutional amendment to prohibit live fire military training, and the leases for military properties are up for renegotiation at this time. Given the historical context of the experience of the Hawaiian people and the growth of uh, a native movement, what are your thoughts about how that will color our politics?
Oh, I think it will have certainly impact this session. The That, along with a larger set of issues that connects to DHHL and the need for more housing, I think are all going to be major issues. So the military and housing, for two reasons. First, because of the historical reasons that you've already mentioned, because Native Hawaiians are very well organized, and are likely to make that a priority to turn out for legislative hearings. And the other reason is that the those districts where there tends to be a relatively high percentage of Native Hawaiian residents are some of the most competitive districts in the entire state. And so I think that some of those issues are going to receive particular attention um, because those districts, particularly on the leeward side of Oahu, have become so politically competitive recently. And so when there are competitive districts that Democrats want to win, that Republicans want to win, that also makes the issues folks in those districts care about far more relevant to the legislature and likely to get quite a bit more attention. So I think you're in all of those issues. I think you're likely to see a lot of attention because of organization, but also because of competition.
Coming full circle to our earlier discussion, it's interesting to note that there has been quite a rise in Republican participation in districts where there are high populations of Native Hawaiians. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think that, I mean, this is a story of mobilization, and this is a story where I would give Republicans a lot of credit. You know, maybe the Central Party has been in disarray for a long time, but there are some very talented young Republicans and organizers who understood that um, these were persuadable voters who might vote for Republicans if candidates spoke to those issues, if they ran Native Hawaiian candidates, which they often have, to great success, and zeroed in on the issues that voters in those districts cared about. And so you've seen a lot of attention, not just on DHHL, but you know, potential proposals to limit outside investment in housing and a variety of issues that candidates like Senator Awa, like newly elected Senator Samantha DeCourt, and the other Republicans on the West Side have really zeroed in on focused on, and I think much to their benefit. The Republican brand here has been very local, very focused on the issues those communities care about, um, and uh, uh, and represented by, I think, relatively young and very talented political leaders who have been very skilled, in particular, at understanding new media. Some of the best uses of social media, I think, come from Republicans who manage to be accessible, funny, have some of the biggest social media presence. I think it makes it more attractive to young voters and voters who aren't traditional voters, aren't the traditional sort of Democratic HGA voters who turn out for every election. And I think that's very admirable, and I think it explains a lot of the success in getting voters who might not be traditional Republican voters to give the party a chance and to connect to them both on their issues, but through a real talent at social media communication.
Colin, you mentioned social media, uh, which reminds me of the fact that it's also a conduit for the influence of federal and national perspectives on politics here in Hawaii. We've been alluding to it all throughout our conversation. What is the impact of politics at the national level going to have on our 2026 elections here in Hawaii?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, everyone's heard the phrase "all politics is local," and interestingly, in the last 20 years or so, that's been increasingly less and less true on the mainland. More and more, you see that all politics is national. That even local issues end up being filtered through a national lens. You've seen highly divided and polarized city councils in a way that you never used to see decades ago. I think that's happened a little bit on Hawaii. I don't think nearly to the extent it's happened on the mainland. I mean, I think just what we've been talking through, most political discussions here do, I think, tend to be grounded in local issues. I don't see that level of influence that you see on the mainland, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So it has certainly has started to happen. There is certainly a MAGA movement on the island. I think that the progressives have been very influenced by progressives on the mainland, but we are, compared to most states, I think, less influenced by national politics. Um, uh, Now, what will the elections coming up? How will that affect local elections? I would say that probably this is likely to hurt Republicans. I think Republicans could have a tougher year. Why do I say that? Well, they benefited hugely during the last election from having President Trump on the top of the ballot. They're not going to have that advantage this year. And many Democrats, because of their anger at Republicans and the Trump administration. So this is where I think national politics will particularly come into play, is in turnout. Want to express their opposition, and so that's going to happen through turnout. And I think Democrats, as is often the case, the party out of power is often more motivated to turn out because anger is a great motivator. And so I think you're likely to see more Democrats turn out than Republicans this time. I don't know what that will mean for the House election. So of the 3 Republicans in the Senate, 2 aren't up for election this year, so it's only Senator Kurt Favela who's potentially vulnerable. I don't see opportunities for Republicans to pick up another Senate seat this cycle, but we don't even know who's all running yet. It won't even open until February 2nd, so maybe that will shift a bit. I think that Republicans will have a tough time defending all 9 of their House seats. So my guess is that Republicans might lose a couple of House seats this election because they're not going to benefit from having Trump on the top of the ballot, which will motivate local Republicans to turn out.
Colin, I remember a time when we could pretty much describe Hawaii politics by suggesting somebody read Tom Kaufman's Catch a Wave or Gavin Dawes' Money and Power. And that speaks to an era which was getting long when it was 20, 30, 40, 50 years. We're almost at a century now. Looking forward in terms of Hawaii politics, do you see any big trends changing the trajectory of what has been local politics for nearly a century?
I do. I mean, I think we will move to a more polarized political environment. It will accelerate as the older guard of the Democratic Party retires and is replaced. I think you're likely to see a sharper division between Republicans and progressive Democrats here. We'll follow the trends on the mainland, but maybe 15 years later. And so I think I think we can look to more ideological, more polarized politics. If you want to see what I think is the future of Hawaii politics, I think you can look to Maui, actually. Maui tends to run a little hotter than most of the state politically. It tends to be more ideologically divided between a very clear progressive camp and a more conservative, business-friendly camp. But the brand of politics that is practiced there, I think, tends to be more vocally ideological. And so I think that may be what is in store for the future, but it's going to be a way out. I don't expect to see that really turn over in the next couple of election cycles. I think that, for the most part, most elected officials and most local voters tend to be relatively moderate. Every time someone predicts a huge rise, for example, among progressives, it never really comes true. We elect a couple, but for the most part, the flavor of politics here tends to be relatively moderate. So I think you can expect that to continue with a move to greater polarization, but relatively slower in the next decade or so.
Well, fascinating. I want to thank you, Colin, for your insights. I've enjoyed this conversation, and I know our viewers have as well. We'll welcome you back again soon. To those of you watching today, thank you for tuning in to Talk Story with Keli'i Akina. And we'll be back again with all of you on ThinkTech Hawaii. Aloha.